The rotor blades sliced through the Montana blizzard like knives through cotton, each revolution fighting against winds that could flip a Black Hawk helicopter like a coin. Captain Sarah Mitchell gripped the collective with steady hands, her 48-year-old fingers reading the aircraft's vibrations like braille, while the storm tried to tear her from the sky. Through the cockpit windscreen, visibility was zero, just a wall of white that had already claimed 2 aircraft and 6 lives in the past 72 hours. "Altitude critical, we're in the trees," shouted Sergeant Rodriguez through the intercom, his voice barely audible over the screaming wind and the laboring engines. Sarah's jaw tightened as she felt the helicopter sink toward the invisible mountain slope below. The instruments showed conflicting information: GPS failing, altimeter reading errors due to pressure differential, and navigation systems confused by the metallic ore deposits in these peaks. She was flying blind in conditions that had grounded every other pilot at Fort Blackwood, relying on instincts carved from 24 years of pulling people out of places where helicopters weren't supposed to go. The emergency beacon crackled through her headset. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Ranger Team Delta. We have wounded. Repeat, we have wounded. Cannot reach extract LZ. Storm getting worse." Sarah pulled collective and cyclic in perfect harmony. The Black Hawk clawing upward through the whiteout as she searched for the narrow ledge where 12 Special Forces soldiers waited for a miracle. The mountain peaks around Mount Cascade had become a death trap, and she was the only pilot crazy enough or experienced enough to fly into it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Part 1. The Weathered Hands. The simulation room at Fort Blackwood felt like a pressure cooker as Captain Sarah Mitchell completed her 100th perfect landing in conditions that would have killed most pilots. The flight simulator recreated every nightmare scenario the military could imagine: brownout landings in desert sandstorms, auto-rotations with complete engine failure, and night extractions under enemy fire. But what the younger pilots crowding around the observation windows didn't understand was that Sarah had lived through most of these scenarios for real. Her weathered hands moved across the controls with unconscious precision, each switch and lever positioned exactly where muscle memory demanded. 24 years of flying rotary wing aircraft had etched these movements into her nervous system, deeper than conscious thought. While the hotshot pilots fresh from flight school relied on instruments and procedures, Sarah flew by feel, reading the helicopter's mood through vibrations in the airframe and changes in engine tone that textbooks couldn't teach. The simulation ended with another flawless score, but Sarah could feel the eyes on her back as she climbed out of the cockpit. Fort Blackwood Army Aviation Base had become a young pilot's playground, filled with 20-something aviators who believed that newer was automatically better. They flew state-of-the-art helicopters loaded with digital displays and automated systems, marveling at technology that made flying seem almost too easy. "Still showing off for the kids, Mitchell." The voice belonged to Lieutenant Jake Stevens, call sign Viper, whose 26 years on Earth had been marked by perfect test scores, flawless fitness reports, and an ego that could be seen from orbit. His flight suit bore the crisp creases of someone who spent more time in briefing rooms than cockpits, and his sandy hair never seemed to move despite Montana's persistent wind. Sarah shouldered her flight bag and turned to face the cocky young pilot. "Just maintaining proficiency, Stevens. Something you might want to try when you're not busy polishing your awards." Viper's cheeks flushed red, a reaction that told Sarah everything she needed to know about his thin skin. The lieutenant was technically proficient and undeniably gifted, but he'd never flown a real emergency, never pulled wounded soldiers from a hot landing zone, never felt the sickening drop of a helicopter losing power over hostile territory. His experience was digital, clean, and completely theoretical. "Maybe you should focus on learning the new systems instead of showing off with the old ones," Viper shot back. The Army's moving forward, and pilots who can't adapt get left behind. Sarah studied the young pilot's face, seeing herself 20 years ago, confident, aggressive, and absolutely convinced that nothing could touch her. She'd learned differently in the mountains of Afghanistan, the jungles of Colombia, and the deserts of Iraq. Experience was written in scars, both physical and emotional, that Viper hadn't earned yet. Adaptation requires having something to adapt from, Sarah replied calmly. Experience isn't obsolete just because you've never needed it. The observation deck overlooked the main hangar where rows of MH-6OM Black Hawks sat like sleeping predators. These weren't the standard utility helicopters that most Army pilots flew. They were special operations variants, modified for missions that pushed both aircraft and crew beyond normal limits. Sarah had flown combat missions in birds like these when Viper was still in high school, learning firsthand why the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment earned the nickname Night Stalkers. Colonel David Harrison appeared at the top of the observation deck stairs, his polished boots clicking against metal steps with military precision. At 39, Harrison was the youngest base commander in the regiment's history, a fast-track officer whose career had been built on efficiency reports and staff assignments rather than stick time. His chest displayed ribbons from Iraq and Afghanistan, but Sarah knew most of his deployment time had been spent in air-conditioned headquarters rather than cockpits. "Captain Mitchell," Harrison called out with the tone of authority he'd practiced. "In front of mirrors, a word, if you please." Sarah followed the colonel to his office, a sterile space decorated with photographs of Harrison shaking hands with general officers and receiving various awards. The walls showed no pictures of aircraft or aircrew, just the political theater that defined modern military careers. Harrison gestured to a chair position precisely to give him the psychological advantage of looking down at visitors. "Your performance scores continue to be exemplary," Harrison began, consulting a tablet that probably contained Sarah's entire career summarized in bullet points. "However, I'm concerned about your adaptability to new technologies and training methods." Sarah remained silent, recognizing the setup for what it was. Harrison had been building a case against her for months, collecting minor incidents and subjective evaluations that painted her as a relic from an earlier era. The fact that she consistently outperformed pilots half her age didn't matter if it couldn't be quantified in the metrics that career officers understood. "The regiment is evolving," Harrison continued, warming to his prepared speech. "Modern helicopter operations require pilots who can integrate seamlessly with digital systems, multi-platform communications, and networked battlefield management. We need aviators who think in terms of data fusion and sensor networks, not instinct. And seat-of-the-pants flying." The colonel paused for effect, probably imagining how this conversation would look in his next efficiency report. Sarah had seen this dance before: ambitious officers using experienced personnel as stepping stones to higher ranks. Harrison needed to prove his vision of modernization by removing examples of the old ways, and Sarah represented everything he wanted to leave behind. "Lieutenant Stevens has been showing exceptional aptitude for advanced systems integration," Harrison said, finally getting to his real agenda. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." His test scores and simulator evaluations exceed regulation standards, and his academic background in aeronautical engineering gives him insights into aircraft performance that, frankly, older pilots struggle to match. Sarah felt familiar heat building in her chest, the same anger that had sustained her through 2 decades of proving herself in a male-dominated profession. She'd faced this conversation before with other commanders who confused classroom knowledge with operational competence, who believed that understanding equations was more valuable than reading the sky. "With all due respect, sir," Sarah said carefully, "Lieutenant Stevens has never flown a real emergency." His exceptional aptitude has been demonstrated exclusively in controlled environments, with predetermined outcomes. The mountains don't care about his engineering degree when the weather turns to shit and people are dying. Harrison's expression hardened at Sarah's blunt assessment. He'd surrounded himself with staff officers who treated his opinions as gospel, and direct challenges to his judgment weren't welcome in his sterile command philosophy. "That's exactly the kind of outdated thinking I'm talking about," Harrison replied sharply. "Modern aviation isn't about individual heroics or cowboy flying. It's about systems, procedures, and standardized responses to emergency situations. We have technology now that makes pilot experience less critical than pilot training." The statement hung in the air like a challenge, revealing the fundamental divide between Harrison's theoretical approach to leadership and Sarah's practical understanding of aviation. She'd flown missions where technology failed, where procedures didn't account for reality, where the difference between life and death came down to a pilot's ability to make split-second decisions based on hard-won experience. "Sir, with respect, technology doesn't replace judgment," Sarah said, keeping her voice level despite the frustration building inside her. "It enhances it. But when systems fail, and they always fail at the worst possible moment, experience is what brings people home alive." Harrison leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying what he saw as a teachable moment. His expression carried the smugness of someone who'd never had his theories tested by reality, who'd built his career on the assumption that military aviation was becoming as predictable as commercial flying. "That's precisely the problem," he said with obvious satisfaction. "You're stuck in old paradigms, Captain. You think flying is still about seat-of-the-pants instincts and individual skill, when it's really about leveraging technology to minimize human error. The future belongs to pilots who can maximize system capabilities, not those who try to overcome system limitations through personal heroics." Sarah stared at the colonel, recognizing the fundamental disconnect between his classroom theories and the reality of military aviation. Harrison had never felt a helicopter lose power at night over hostile territory, never tried to land in a sandstorm with wounded soldiers bleeding in the cabin, never made split-second decisions that meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "Stevens represents the future of this regiment," Harrison continued, obviously pleased with his logic. "Younger pilots who understand that modern aviation is about precision, predictability, and technological integration. Frankly, Captain, your approach to flying belongs to an earlier era, and continuing to indulge outdated methods sends the wrong message to junior aviators." The meeting was clearly over, despite Harrison's pretense of seeking Sarah's input. He'd already made his decision and was simply going through the motions of appearing consultative. Sarah had seen enough military politics to recognize a done deal, but she also understood that Harrison's vision of modern aviation was dangerously naive. "Is there anything else, sir?" Sarah asked, standing to leave. "Actually, yes," Harrison said, consulting his tablet again. "I'm recommending you for the Senior Aviator Transition Program. It's an excellent opportunity to contribute to aviation development from an administrative perspective, working with acquisition teams to evaluate new technologies and training protocols." Sarah recognized the offer for what it was, a face-saving way to remove her from flight status, while providing Harrison with political cover. The transition program was where the Army sent pilots who were too experienced to fire, but too inconvenient to keep flying. It was administrative exile disguised as professional development. "I'll consider the opportunity, sir," Sarah replied diplomatically, though they both knew she had no intention of accepting a desk job. As Sarah left Harrison's office, she could hear him already placing a call to Stevens, probably to discuss the lieutenant's expanded role in squadron operations. The conversation would be full of phrases like modernization initiative and technological integration, but the real message would be clear: experience was being replaced by enthusiasm, and wisdom was being traded for computer literacy. The hangar felt like sanctuary after Harrison's sterile office. Chief Warrant Officer Maria Santos was performing a pre-flight inspection on one of the Black Hawks, her experienced eye-catching details that younger mechanics might miss. At 52, Santos was the senior maintainer for the squadron's special operations aircraft, with hands-on knowledge of helicopter systems that couldn't be learned from technical manuals. "Rough meeting with the colonel?" Santos asked without looking up from the transmission she was examining. "He's got vision," Sarah replied dryly. "Unfortunately, it doesn't extend much past his computer screen." Santos chuckled, understanding the tension between old-school aviation and modern management theories. As a warrant officer, she existed in the middle ground between enlisted mechanics and commissioned officers, seeing both the technical reality of aircraft maintenance and the political reality of military leadership. Stevens was by earlier, asking about modifying the cockpit displays for better systems integration, Santos said. "Kid's got some interesting ideas, but he wants to fix problems that don't exist while ignoring ones that do." Sarah nodded, recognizing the pattern. Young pilots often focused on technological solutions because they were measurable and impressive, while overlooking fundamental issues that couldn't be solved with better software. Stevens probably saw aviation as an engineering problem rather than a human one. "What kind of modifications?" Sarah asked. "More digital displays, automated checklists, integrated warning systems," Santos replied. "Basically turning the cockpit into a video game." He doesn't understand that sometimes pilots need to feel what the aircraft is telling them, not just read what the computers think is happening. The conversation was interrupted by the base public address system crackling to life with an announcement. That would change everything. "All available aircrew report to operations immediately. Emergency tasking. Repeat, emergency tasking." Sarah and Santos exchanged glances, recognizing the tone that meant people were in trouble and helicopters were the only solution. They'd both heard that announcement before, usually preceding missions. That tested every skill they'd learned over decades of military aviation. The operations center buzzed with controlled chaos as aircrews, intelligence officers, and support personnel gathered around situation maps and communication consoles. Sarah could see the tension in everyone's faces, the kind of focused intensity that meant lives were hanging in the balance somewhere beyond the reach of normal rescue capabilities. Major Lisa Chun, the squadron intelligence officer, stood at the front of the room with a laser pointer and grim expression. Behind her, a large screen displayed topographical maps of the northern Idaho wilderness, where the Rocky Mountains created some of the most challenging flying conditions in North America. Ranger Team Delta went missing 6 hours ago during a training exercise in the Mount Cascade Range, Chun began, her voice carrying the professional calm that intelligence officers used to deliver bad news. Last radio contact placed them at approximately 10,000 feet elevation when the storm system moved in faster than predicted. The screen switched to weather data that made everyone in the room wince. Winds gusting to 70 miles per hour. Snow falling at rates that made visibility effectively zero. And temperatures dropping to levels that made survival problematic for anyone caught in the open. Current conditions exceed safe flying parameters for standard aircraft, Chun continued. 2 rescue attempts have already been aborted due to weather, and the forecast shows the storm intensifying over the next 12 hours. Sarah studied the maps, recognizing terrain she'd flown before in better conditions. The Mount Cascade Range was notorious for creating its own weather patterns, with peaks and valleys that channeled wind in unpredictable directions. Even in clear conditions, the area required careful planning and experienced piloting. In a blizzard, it became a death trap. "What's the team's status?" asked Captain Mike Turner, one of the squadron's newer pilots. "Unknown," Chun replied. "Emergency beacon is transmitting, but we've had no voice contact since the storm hit. Given the temperature and wind conditions, exposure becomes critical after 18 hours. We're now at hour 6. The mathematics of survival were brutal but simple. 12 Special Forces soldiers, presumably with standard cold weather gear, could survive exposure for perhaps 24 to 36 hours if they found shelter and stayed together. But if anyone was injured, if their equipment was damaged, or if they'd been separated during the storm, those numbers dropped dramatically. Colonel Harrison entered the operations center with his characteristic air of controlled authority, scanning the assembled aircrew with the expression of someone calculating political risks, along with operational ones. Sarah could almost see his mental checklist: mission complexity, weather conditions, potential for failure, and impact on his career trajectory. "What are our options?" Harrison asked Chun, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be pleasant. "Limited, sir," Chun replied. "Standard rescue protocols require minimum visibility of half a mile and wind speeds below 40 miles per hour. Current conditions show zero visibility and sustained winds of 55, with gusts to 70. Harrison nodded, recognizing the regulatory constraints that governed military aviation. The Army had developed extensive safety protocols after many accidents involving helicopters pushed beyond their operational limits. Those protocols existed for good reasons, but they also meant that some missions simply couldn't be flown under current regulations. "Sir," Stevens interjected, stepping forward with obvious eagerness, "I've been reviewing the technical specifications for modified flight profiles in extreme weather. With proper systems integration and automated navigation aids, I believe we could develop an approach that minimizes pilot workload while maximizing aircraft capability." Sarah felt her jaw clench at Stevens' typical response-throwing technology. At a problem that required judgment and experience, the lieutenant was probably imagining himself as the hero of this rescue, using his engineering background to solve what he saw as a technical challenge rather than a human one. Harrison's expression showed interest in Stevens' proposal, seeing an opportunity to demonstrate his faith in modern aviation methods. "Explain your thinking, Lieutenant." Stevens moved to the map display with the confidence of someone who'd studied the problem extensively in textbooks. "The primary challenges are navigation accuracy and aircraft control in severe turbulence. However, if we utilize GPS augmentation systems and integrate flight control computers to compensate for wind variations, we can reduce the piloting demands to manageable levels." The explanation sounded impressive to anyone who hadn't tried to fly a helicopter in a blizzard. Stevens was treating the mission like a mathematical equation, assuming that technology could solve problems that had killed experienced pilots. For decades, his approach ignored the fundamental reality that computers couldn't read the sky the way human pilots could. "Interesting approach," Harrison said approvingly. "How long would you need to prepare for such a mission?" 6 hours. "For systems integration and flight planning," Stevens replied confidently. "The technology exists, we just need to optimize it for these specific conditions." Sarah couldn't remain silent any longer. "Sir, with all due respect, Lieutenant Stevens is talking about experimental procedures in conditions that have already killed 2 crews. This isn't a systems integration problem, it's a survival problem." Harrison's expression hardened at Sarah's interruption, clearly annoyed by her challenge to his golden boy's technical solution. "Captain Mitchell, unless you have a better proposal, I suggest you let Lieutenant Stevens explain his approach." "I do have a better proposal, sir," Sarah replied, feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with committing to a dangerous course of action. "Send someone who's actually flown in these conditions before." The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications of Sarah's statement. She was volunteering for a mission that had already been classified as impossible, using methods that Harrison had specifically criticized as outdated and dangerous. "Captain," Harrison said slowly, "the weather conditions exceed all safety parameters. Attempting this mission with conventional flying techniques would be suicide." Sarah met the colonel's gaze directly, drawing on 24 years of experience that had taught her the difference between acceptable risk and reckless heroism. "Sir, 12 soldiers are going to die if we don't get them off that mountain. Technology isn't going to solve this problem, only experience can." The statement hung in the air like a challenge, forcing everyone in the room to confront the fundamental question of military aviation. When do you risk everything to save lives, and who do you trust to make that decision? Harrison's face showed the internal calculation of a career officer weighing political risks against operational necessity. Approving Sarah's mission would mean acknowledging that his modernization theories might be wrong, while refusing would mean accepting the loss of 12 soldiers due to administrative caution. "The conditions are impossible," Harrison repeated, but his voice carried less conviction than before. "No, sir," Sarah replied firmly. "The conditions are just very, very difficult. There's a difference, and sometimes that difference is all that matters. The tension in the operations center crystallized around a fundamental question that had been brewing for months at Fort Blackwood." Stevens stepped closer to the map display, his finger tracing potential flight paths through the mountain valleys with the precision of someone who had studied every topographical detail without ever seeing the terrain firsthand. His confidence radiated the kind of certainty that only came from theoretical knowledge unchallenged by practical experience. "The key is understanding that modern helicopter flight management systems can compensate for pilot limitations in extreme conditions," Stevens explained, his voice carrying the evangelical tone of someone preaching technological salvation. "We're not talking about flying by instinct anymore. We're talking about leveraging computational power to overcome environmental challenges that would defeat conventional piloting methods." Sarah watched the young lieutenant present his case, recognizing the dangerous blend of intelligence and inexperience that made him simultaneously impressive and hazardous. Stevens understood helicopter aerodynamics better than most pilots. Twice his age, could recite performance specifications from memory, and had mastered every digital system the Army used. What he lacked was the wisdom to know when all that knowledge wasn't enough. "The flight management computer can process wind vector data faster than any human pilot," Stevens continued, warming to his theme. "Integrated GPS systems provide navigation accuracy within 3 meters, even in zero visibility. Automated flight control responses can compensate for turbulence and wind shear before a pilot even recognizes the threat. We're essentially talking about letting the aircraft fly itself, while the pilot monitors systems and makes strategic decisions." Colonel Harrison nodded approvingly, seeing validation for his vision of modern military aviation. The colonel's understanding of helicopter operations came primarily from briefings and technical reports rather than stick time. But Stevens' presentation aligned perfectly with his belief that technology could solve problems that had historically required experience and judgment. "How would you handle the mountain terrain effects?" asked Major Chun, her intelligence background making her skeptical of solutions that seemed too elegant for complex problems. Stevens switched the display to a 3-dimensional terrain model that showed the Mount Cascade Range in stunning detail. Every peak, valley, and ridgeline was mapped with precision that would have seemed magical to pilots of earlier generations. The computer-generated landscape looked clean and manageable, reduced to colored contour lines and elevation numbers that suggested the mountains could be understood through data analysis. Terrain following radar integrated with digital elevation models provides real-time obstacle avoidance, Stevens replied confidently. The system can identify terrain features and wind patterns faster than human perception, automatically adjusting flight path and power settings to maintain safe separation from ground obstacles. Essentially, the aircraft becomes aware of its environment in ways that exceed human sensory capabilities. Sarah felt her frustration building as she listened to Stevens reduce mountain flying to a computer programming exercise. The lieutenant was describing systems that worked perfectly in controlled environments, but had never been tested in the kind of conditions that killed experienced pilots. His faith in technology was absolute because it had never been betrayed by reality. What about system failures? Sarah interjected, her voice cutting through Stephen's technical presentation. What happens when your terrain-following radar gets confused by snow, or your GPS loses signal in the mountains, or your flight management computer gives you false altitude readings because of pressure variations? Stephen's expression showed mild annoyance at Sarah's interruption, as if she were questioning basic mathematical principles rather than pointing out practical limitations. That's exactly the kind of outdated thinking that holds back aviation progress, he replied with barely concealed condescension. Modern systems have multiple redundancies and backup protocols. The probability of total system failure is statistically insignificant. Statistics don't mean much when you're the pilot experiencing that insignificant probability, Sarah shot back. I've flown missions where every system failed except pilot judgment, and judgment is something you can't download from a computer. Harrison stepped forward to regain control of the discussion, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. His vision of modern command relied on orderly processes and technological solutions, not debates about the reliability of systems he'd never personally operated. Gentlemen, ladies, Harrison said with forced calm, we need to focus on viable solutions rather than philosophical differences about aviation methodology. Lieutenant Stevens has presented a technically sound approach that leverages our most advanced capabilities. Captain Mitchell, unless you have specific objections to the technical aspects of his proposal, I think we should proceed with detailed planning. Sarah recognized the dismissive tone that Harrison used when he wanted to end discussions that challenged his predetermined conclusions. The colonel had already decided that Stevens represented the future and Sarah represented the past, and no amount of practical experience would change his mind. But 12 soldiers were dying on a mountain, and political considerations didn't alter the laws of physics. Sir, my objection is that Lieutenant Stevens has never flown in actual mountain conditions, let alone extreme weather, Sarah said, keeping her voice level despite her growing frustration. His proposal sounds impressive in a briefing room, but it's based on assumptions that won't hold up when the technology fails, and it will fail. Stephen's face reddened at Sarah's direct challenge to his competence, revealing the thin skin that often accompanied oversized egos. Captain Mitchell, I've logged over 400 hours in advanced simulators that replicate exact mountain conditions, he replied defensively. I've successfully completed every extreme weather scenario in the training database with performance scores that exceed regulation standards. Simulators don't kill you when you make mistakes, Sarah replied bluntly. And they don't account for the 1,000 variables that real mountains throw at real pilots. Experience isn't about memorizing procedures, it's about surviving situations that don't have procedures. The exchange revealed the fundamental divide that had been growing within military aviation for years. Younger pilots like Stevens relied heavily on technological solutions and standardized procedures, believing that proper training and advanced systems could overcome any challenge. Older pilots like Sarah had learned through hard experience that technology was a tool, not a substitute for judgment, and that some situations required adapting to circumstances that no training program could anticipate. Chief Warrant Officer Santos had been quietly observing the discussion from the back of the room, her mechanic's perspective providing insights that neither pilots nor commanders fully appreciated. As the person responsible for keeping helicopters flying, she understood the gap between theoretical capabilities and practical limitations better than anyone in the room. If I may, sir, Santos interjected, her warrant officer status giving her permission to speak more directly than most enlisted personnel. The aircraft Lieutenant Stevens wants to use for this mission has never been flight tested in these specific conditions. The integrated systems he's describing work well in controlled environments, but we don't have operational data for blizzard conditions with sustained winds over 50 miles per hour. Harrison frowned at Santos' input, clearly uncomfortable with technical complications, and interfered with his preference for clean solutions. Are you saying the systems won't work, Chief? I'm saying we don't know if they'll work, Santos replied carefully. The flight management computers assume certain environmental parameters, and extreme weather can push those parameters beyond design specifications. When that happens, the systems start making decisions based on incorrect data, which is worse than having no systems at all. Stevens looked genuinely surprised by Santos' assessment, his confidence shaken by the possibility that his technological solutions might be inadequate. But the specifications clearly state that the systems are designed for extreme weather operations, he protested. Designed for, yes, Santos replied patiently. Tested in, no. There's a difference between engineering specifications and operational reality. I've seen advanced systems fail in conditions they were supposedly designed to handle, usually because the engineers didn't account for variables they couldn't measure in laboratories. The conversation was interrupted by an urgent radio transmission from the Search and Rescue Coordination Center. Fort Blackwood operations, this is Malmstrom Rescue Control. Be advised, weather conditions in the Mount Cascade area are deteriorating faster than predicted. Current winds sustained at 65 miles per hour with gusts to 80. Visibility 0 in snow and blowing snow. Temperature dropping to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. The updated weather report sent a chill through the operations center that had nothing to do with the outdoor temperature. 80-mile-per-hour wind gusts were beyond the operational limits of any helicopter in the Army inventory, and -20 degrees made survival increasingly unlikely for anyone exposed to the elements. How long can the Ranger team survive in those conditions? Harrison asked Chun, his voice betraying concern that transcended career considerations. Unknown, sir, Chun replied grimly. Standard cold weather gear provides protection for 12 to 18 hours in stationary conditions, but if they're mobile or if anyone is injured, that timeline decreases significantly. Wind chill at -20 with 80 mile per hour. Gusts creates effective temperatures below -60 degrees. The mathematics of survival were becoming increasingly desperate. Every hour of delay reduced the probability of finding the Rangers alive, but flying in conditions that exceeded aircraft limitations would only add helicopter crews to the casualty list without saving anyone. Sir, Stevens said, his voice showing less confidence than before, perhaps we should consider waiting for a break in the weather. The forecast shows possible improvement in 18 hours. Sarah felt a surge of anger at Stevens' sudden retreat from his technological optimism. Minutes earlier, he'd been confident that advanced systems could overcome any environmental challenge. Now, faced with actual conditions that exceeded his experience, he was advocating delay that would certainly result in deaths. 18 hours means they're dead, Sarah said flatly. If we're going to save them, it has to be now, while they still have a chance of surviving. Harrison studied the weather data with the expression of a commander weighing impossible choices. Approving a mission in current conditions violated every safety protocol he'd sworn to uphold, but refusing to act guaranteed the loss of 12 soldiers who might otherwise be saved. Captain Mitchell, Harrison said slowly, even if I were inclined to approve such a mission, regulations specifically prohibit flight operations in conditions that exceed aircraft limitations. Wind speeds above 50 miles per hour are an absolute prohibition for helicopter operations. Sir, those regulations exist to prevent unnecessary risks, Sarah replied. But this isn't unnecessary, it's the only chance those soldiers have. Sometimes you have to choose between following regulations and saving lives. The statement hung in the air like a challenge to everything Harrison believed about military command. His career had been built on following procedures and minimizing risks, trusting that regulations existed for good reasons and that deviation led to disaster. Sarah was asking him to abandon that philosophy based on her personal conviction. That experience could overcome impossible odds. "Captain, I appreciate your willingness to volunteer," Harrison said carefully, "but I cannot authorize a mission that has such a low probability of success. The risk to aircraft and crew is unacceptable given the minimal chance of reaching the Ranger team." Sarah felt the familiar frustration of dealing with commanders who confused caution with wisdom. Harrison was making a rational decision based on statistical analysis and regulatory compliance, but his analysis didn't account for variables that couldn't be quantified in briefing slides. "Sir, with respect, you're calculating odds based on average pilot capabilities," Sarah said. "I'm not an average pilot, and this isn't an average situation. I've flown in conditions that would ground most pilots, and I've brought people home when everyone said it was impossible." Stevens scoffed at Sarah's claim, his earlier uncertainty replaced by renewed confidence in his theoretical knowledge. "Captain, extreme weather doesn't care about pilot experience. Physics is physics, and helicopters have absolute limitations that can't be overcome through personal skill." "You're right that physics is physics," Sarah replied, turning to face the young lieutenant directly. "But physics also says that helicopters can fly in conditions that would kill fixed-wing aircraft if the pilot understands how to work with the aircraft instead of fighting it. Experience teaches you which limitations are absolute and which ones are just really, really difficult." The discussion was becoming increasingly heated as fundamental philosophies of aviation clashed in front of personnel who would be affected by whatever decision Harrison made. Sarah represented the traditional approach of pilot skill and judgment, while Stevens embodied the modern faith in technology and procedures. Harrison found himself caught between approaches he didn't fully understand, forced to make a decision that would define his command philosophy. "I need options," Harrison said finally, his tone suggesting that he was looking for a face-saving compromise rather than a solution to the tactical problem. "Major Chun, what are the alternatives to immediate rescue?" Chun consulted her intelligence files with the thoroughness of someone who understood that her analysis would influence life and death decisions. "Sir, we could request assets from other commands, but everyone in the region is grounded due to weather. We could wait for conditions to improve, but that guarantees casualties. Or we could attempt the mission with our most experienced crew, accepting high risk for the possibility of success." The three options represented the classic military command dilemma: pass responsibility to someone else, wait for better circumstances, or accept risk to achieve objectives. Harrison's choice would reveal whether he was a leader willing to make hard decisions or a manager who avoided responsibility through bureaucratic procedures. "What about using unmanned systems?" Stevens suggested, grasping for technological solutions that might avoid the human risk that was paralyzing command decision-making. Drone reconnaissance could locate the team and assess their condition before committing manned aircraft. Sarah shook her head at Stevens' continued faith in remote solutions for immediate problems. "Drones can't fly in these conditions any better than manned aircraft," she said. "And even if they could, they can't rescue people. You need a helicopter with a crew willing to risk everything to save lives." The debate was interrupted by another radio transmission, this one carrying the desperation that came with deteriorating situations. Any station, this is Ranger Delta. We have multiple casualties from avalanche. Repeat, multiple casualties. We need immediate medical evacuation. Our position is becoming untenable." The transmission sent a shock through the operations center as everyone processed the implications. The Rangers weren't just cold and stranded, they were injured and facing immediate life-threatening conditions. The mission had just escalated from difficult rescue to emergency medical evacuation, raising the stakes beyond survival to preventing multiple deaths. "Sir," Sarah said, her voice carrying the urgency that came with understanding that delay meant death. "We're out of time for debate. Those soldiers need evacuation now, and I'm the only pilot here with enough mountain experience to have any chance of reaching them." Harrison stared at the communication console as if hoping for a miracle that would provide easy answers to impossible questions. His career had prepared him for many challenges, but none that required gambling with lives. Based on one pilot's conviction that experience could overcome insurmountable odds. "Captain Mitchell," Harrison said slowly, "if I authorize this mission, and you fail, we'll have lost additional personnel without saving anyone. If I deny authorization, at least we won't compound the tragedy." "Sir," Sarah replied, meeting the colonel's gaze directly, "if you don't authorize this mission, those Rangers will die knowing that we had a chance to save them and chose not to take it. That's something you'll carry for the rest of your career." The statement forced Harrison to confront the human cost of his command decisions in ways that staff assignments and administrative duties had never required. He was no longer managing resources and following procedures. He was deciding who lived and who died based on calculations that no regulation could make for him. Stephen stepped forward again, apparently unable to accept that his technological solutions were inadequate for the current crisis. "Sir, I request permission to lead the mission using modified flight protocols. I believe my understanding of aircraft systems gives us the best chance of success." Sarah turned to stare at Stevens in disbelief, amazed by his persistence in volunteering for a mission that exceeded his experience by orders of magnitude. The lieutenant's confidence was admirable, but his lack of realistic self-assessment was potentially deadly for everyone involved. "Stevens, you've never flown in weather that would challenge a student pilot, let alone conditions that are grounding experienced aviators across the entire region," Sarah said bluntly. "This isn't a simulation where you can restart if things go wrong. This is real life with real consequences. Captain Mitchell, I resent the implication that I'm not qualified for challenging missions," Stevens replied defensively. "My training has been extensive and my technical knowledge exceeds that of most pilots in the regiment." "Training and knowledge are important," Sarah acknowledged, "but they're not the same as experience. You can't learn mountain flying from books, and you can't practice emergency procedures in conditions that might kill you. Some things can only be learned by surviving them." The argument revealed the generational divide that had been building within military aviation as technology advanced faster than institutional wisdom could adapt. Younger pilots like Stevens had access to training capabilities that previous generations couldn't imagine, but they often lacked the practical experience that taught them when to trust technology and when to rely on instincts. Chief Santos spoke, up again from her position near the maintenance status boards, her practical perspective cutting through the theoretical debates that were consuming valuable time. "Sir, if we're going to attempt this mission, we need to start preparations now. Aircraft systems checks, crew briefings, and emergency equipment loading will take at least 2 hours, and conditions are only getting worse." Harrison looked around the operations center at the faces of personnel who were waiting for his decision, recognizing that his choice would affect not just the immediate mission but the future of his command. Approving Sarah's mission meant acknowledging that experience might be more valuable than technology, while refusing meant accepting responsibility for deaths that might have been prevented. "Chief Santos," Harrison said finally, his voice betraying the reluctance of someone making a decision he didn't fully believe in, "begin preparations for emergency rescue operations. Captain Mitchell, you'll lead the mission, but I want detailed safety protocols and abort criteria established before takeoff." Sarah felt a surge of relief mixed with apprehension as she realized that Harrison had chosen to trust her judgment despite his philosophical objections. The colonel was gambling his career on her ability to accomplish what everyone agreed was impossible, and she understood the weight of responsibility that came with that trust. "Thank you, sir," Sarah said simply. I won't let you down." Stevens looked stunned by Harrison's decision, clearly unable to understand why his technical expertise had been rejected in favor of Sarah's experiential approach. "Sir, I formally request to be assigned as co-pilot for this mission. My systems knowledge could be critical for aircraft performance optimization." Sarah almost smiled at Stevens' persistence, recognizing the combination of genuine desire to help and wounded pride that motivated his request. The lieutenant couldn't accept that his carefully acquired knowledge might be less valuable than skills he'd never had the opportunity to develop. "Stevens," Sarah said, her tone mixing firmness with unexpected gentleness, "this mission is going to require split-second decisions based on reading conditions that instruments can't measure. I need a co-pilot who can think like I do, not one who's trying to prove that technology is better than instinct." "But Captain," Stevens protested, "my understanding of aircraft systems could prevent failures that might compromise the mission." "Your understanding of systems is impressive," Sarah acknowledged, "but what I need is someone who can help me fly when the systems fail. This mission is going to push the aircraft beyond its design limits, and when that happens, technology becomes a distraction rather than an asset." Harrison intervened before the discussion could continue, recognizing that personnel selection was consuming time that the Rangers didn't have. "Captain Mitchell, choose your crew based on mission requirements. We don't have time for further debate." Sarah nodded, her mind already shifting from political considerations to practical preparations. The mission would require every skill she'd developed over 2 decades of military aviation, and success would depend on having crew members who could adapt to circumstances that no training program could anticipate. "I'll take Captain Turner as co-pilot and Sergeant Rodriguez as crew chief," Sarah said, naming personnel whose experience complemented her own. "We'll need full cold weather gear, medical equipment, and emergency survival supplies for the Rangers." As the operations center began transforming into a mission planning hub, Sarah felt the familiar mixture of fear and anticipation that preceded dangerous operations. She'd volunteered for a mission that most pilots would consider suicide, betting her life and the lives of her crew on the conviction that experience could overcome impossible odds. The next few hours would determine whether 24 years of flying helicopters had prepared her for the most challenging mission of her career, or whether Harrison's faith in her abilities would result in a tragedy that would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. Part 3. The Weather Gods. The mission planning room at Fort Blackwood had been transformed into a war room where every detail could mean the difference between rescue and disaster. Sarah spread topographical maps across the large table while Captain Mike Turner, her chosen co-pilot, studied weather patterns on multiple computer screens. Sergeant First Class Tommy Rodriguez checked and rechecked emergency equipment with the methodical precision of someone who understood that forgotten gear could doom a mission. Turner was 34 years old with 8 years of helicopter experience, including 2 combat deployments that had taught him the value of staying calm under pressure. Unlike Stevens, Turner had learned to respect rather than challenge Sarah's judgment, recognizing that her experience represented knowledge he hadn't yet acquired. His role would be to handle communications and systems monitoring while Sarah focused on the demanding task of flying in impossible conditions. Weather update shows sustained winds at 70 miles per hour with gusts to 90, Turner reported from the meteorological display. Visibility remains 0 with heavy snow and blowing snow. Temperature holding steady at -22 degrees Fahrenheit. Sarah nodded grimly as she traced potential approach routes through the mountain valleys, looking for paths that might provide some protection from the worst winds. The Mount Cascade Range created its own weather patterns with peaks and ridgelines that could either shelter aircraft or create deadly downdrafts that could slam helicopters into the ground without warning. The Rangers' last known position puts them on a ledge about 800 feet below the main peak, Sarah said, marking the location with a red pen. Approach from the south, gives us the best terrain masking, but we'll be flying directly into the prevailing wind for the final approach." Rodriguez looked up from the survival equipment he was organizing, his weathered face showing the concern of someone who'd seen too many rescues go wrong. "Ma'am, landing on that ledge in these conditions is going to be tight even under normal circumstances. With zero visibility and hurricane-force winds, we're talking about a precision approach that would challenge most pilots in clear weather." "That's why we're not most pilots," Sarah replied, though she understood Rodriguez's concerns. The crew chief had been flying rescue missions for 15 years, and his job would be to guide Sarah during the critical final approach when visual references would be impossible to maintain. The radio crackled with another transmission from the stranded Rangers, their voices betraying the stress of soldiers facing a situation beyond their control. "Fort Blackwood, this is Ranger Delta. We have 3 casualties requiring immediate medical attention. Avalanche damage includes possible spinal injuries and severe hypothermia. We've rigged emergency shelter, but conditions are deteriorating rapidly." Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with understanding that people were dying while she planned their rescue. Every minute of preparation was necessary for mission success, but every minute of delay reduced the chances of finding the Rangers alive. The balance between thorough planning and urgent action was one of the most difficult aspects of rescue operations. "How long do we have before hypothermia becomes critical?" Sarah asked Turner, who was consulting medical references on his tablet. "In these temperatures, severe hypothermia can develop within 2 to 4 hours for injured personnel," Turner replied. "If they're not getting adequate shelter and warmth, we could be looking at life-threatening conditions within the next hour." The timeline was becoming impossible. Aircraft preparation would take at least 90 minutes. Flight time to the target area was another 45 minutes, and the actual rescue would require at least 30 minutes under ideal conditions. The Rangers would be fighting for their lives long before Sarah could reach them. Chief Santos appeared in the doorway with an expression that mixed determination and concern. "Aircraft is ready for final preparations," she announced. "I've installed additional cold weather equipment and emergency medical supplies, but I need to brief you on system limitations in extreme conditions." Sarah followed Santos to the hangar where their assigned Black Hawk waited under harsh fluorescent lights. The helicopter looked deceptively normal, its angular profile and military gray paint scheme giving no indication of the modifications that made it capable of operations beyond standard limits. But Sarah knew that appearance could be deceiving, and that the aircraft's real capabilities would only be tested under conditions that pushed both machine and crew to their breaking points. "Engine performance dropped significantly in extreme cold," Santos explained as they walked around the aircraft. "You'll have about 15% less power than normal, which means reduced lift capability and longer response times for power changes. Rotor system will be more sensitive to turbulence, and control responses will feel different due to air density changes." Sarah absorbed the technical information while visually inspecting the helicopter, her trained eye noting details that could become critical during the mission. Ice buildup on rotor blades could destroy lift characteristics within minutes. Control surfaces could freeze in position if moisture infiltrated actuator systems. Even minor mechanical problems could become fatal complications when flying in conditions that left no margin for error. "What about systems redundancy?" Sarah asked, knowing that backup equipment often failed when primary systems were stressed. "All backup systems are functional, but extreme cold affects electronics in unpredictable ways," Santos replied honestly. "Navigation systems might develop errors, communication equipment could experience intermittent failures, and engine monitoring displays might give false readings. You'll need to rely more on mechanical instruments and pilot instincts than electronic systems." The assessment confirmed Sarah's expectation that the mission would require old-school flying skills, rather than modern technological solutions. Advanced systems worked well within their design parameters, but extreme conditions often pushed equipment beyond specifications that engineers had never tested. When that happened, pilot experience became the only reliable backup system. Stevens appeared at the hangar entrance, his expression showing the frustration of someone who'd been excluded from what he considered the most important mission of his career. Despite Harrison's decision to assign Sarah as mission commander, the young lieutenant apparently couldn't accept that his services weren't required. "Captain Mitchell," Stevens called out as he approached the aircraft, "I've been reviewing the flight management computer settings for extreme weather operations. I believe I can optimize the automation systems to provide better performance in high wind conditions." Sarah paused in her pre-flight inspection to look at Stevens, recognizing the combination of genuine helpfulness and wounded pride that motivated his continued involvement. The lieutenant's technological expertise might indeed be valuable, but his lack of practical experience made him a potential liability in conditions that would test every skill she possessed. "Stevens, I appreciate your offer," Sarah said diplomatically, "but this mission is going to require manual flying from takeoff to landing. Automation systems aren't designed for the kind of conditions we're flying into, and relying on them could get us killed." "But Captain," Stevens persisted, "the flight management computer can compensate for pilot workload and provide precision approaches that would be impossible using manual techniques. Your approach is essentially throwing away technological advantages that could ensure mission success." Rodriguez looked up from his equipment check with barely concealed annoyance at Stevens' persistence. "Lieutenant, with all due respect, computers don't have instincts, and instincts are what keep you alive when everything else fails. This mission is going to require every skill Captain Mitchell has learned over 24 years of flying, not programming techniques you learned in school." Stevens' face reddened at Rodriguez's blunt assessment, clearly stung by the implication that his education was less valuable than practical experience. "Sergeant, modern aviation is about leveraging technology to overcome human limitations. Relying on outdated methods when advanced systems are available is both inefficient and dangerous." "What's dangerous?" Sarah interjected firmly, "is trusting technology that hasn't been tested in the conditions we're about to face. When systems fail, and they will fail, experience is what brings people home alive." The philosophical argument was interrupted by Colonel Harrison's arrival in the hangar, his presence immediately refocusing everyone's attention on the immediate mission requirements. The colonel's expression showed the strain of someone who'd committed to a course of action he wasn't entirely confident in, but who understood that leadership sometimes required difficult decisions. "Status report," Harrison requested, his tone suggesting that he was looking for reassurance that the mission had some reasonable chance of success. "Aircraft ready for departure in 30 minutes, Santos replied. "Crew briefing complete, emergency equipment loaded, communication systems tested. Weather conditions remain at the edge of aircraft limitations, but the crew believes the mission is feasible." Harrison nodded, though Sarah could see the doubt in his expression. The colonel was gambling his career on her conviction that experience could overcome impossible odds, and his uncertainty was understandable given the unprecedented nature of the mission. "Captain Mitchell," Harrison said, "I want you to understand that this mission is entirely voluntary. No one would question your judgment if you decided that conditions are too dangerous to proceed." Sarah met the colonel's gaze directly, recognizing his offer as both genuine concern and potential escape from responsibility. Harrison was giving her the opportunity to abort the mission without losing face, but she also understood that accepting his offer would doom the Rangers to certain death. "Sir, 12 soldiers are counting on us," Sarah replied simply. "That's all the motivation I need." Stevens stepped forward one final time, apparently unable to accept that his expertise wouldn't be required. "Colonel, I formally request permission to accompany this mission as systems specialist. My technical knowledge could be critical if aircraft systems experience problems." Harrison looked between Stevens and Sarah, clearly torn between his confidence in the lieutenant's abilities and his recognition that Sarah needed complete authority over crew selection. The colonel's faith in technological solutions made Stevens' request seem reasonable, but his growing respect for Sarah's judgment suggested that her crew choices should be honored. "Captain Mitchell, it's your mission," Harrison said finally. "Do you want Lieutenant Stevens as part of the crew?" Sarah considered the question carefully, weighing Stevens' technical skills against the potential complications of flying with someone whose philosophy of aviation fundamentally differed from her own. The lieutenant was competent and well-intentioned, but his reliance on systems that might fail could create dangerous conflicts during critical moments. "Sir, I need crew members who can adapt to circumstances that don't have procedures," Sarah said diplomatically. "Lieutenant Stevens is an excellent pilot, but this mission requires a different kind of expertise." Stevens looked stunned by Sarah's polite rejection, clearly unable to understand why his qualifications weren't sufficient for the most challenging mission of his career. "Captain, I don't understand your reasoning. My technical background gives me capabilities that could be essential for mission success." "Stevens," Sarah said, her tone mixing firmness with unexpected patience, "technical knowledge is important, but this mission is going to require reading conditions that instruments can't measure. I need crew members who can think like I do when everything goes wrong." The exchange revealed the fundamental difference between pilots who relied on technology and those who viewed it as a tool rather than a solution. Stevens had been trained to trust systems and procedures, while Sarah had learned through experience that survival often required abandoning both in favor of instincts that couldn't be programmed or taught. Turner finished his final systems check and joined the group near the aircraft, his expression showing the focused calm of someone preparing for a dangerous mission. "All communication and navigation systems tested and operational," he reported. "Emergency frequencies programmed, survival equipment secured, medical supplies loaded for 12 casualties." Rodriguez completed his own preparations with the thorough attention to detail that distinguished experienced crew chiefs from their younger counterparts. "Aircraft configured for maximum range and emergency rescue operations," he announced. "Cold weather equipment tested, rescue hoist operational. Emergency medical equipment ready for immediate use." Sarah felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and apprehension that preceded difficult missions. Every preparation had been completed, every system had been tested, and every contingency had been planned. But she also understood that planning could only go so far, and that success would ultimately depend on her ability to adapt to conditions that no amount of preparation could fully anticipate. "Time to go," Sarah announced, climbing into the pilot's seat and beginning the startup sequence that would commit them to a mission most pilots would consider impossible. The Black Hawk's engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, the sound echoing through the hangar like a mechanical prayer for success. Sarah felt the familiar vibration of rotors beginning to turn, the rhythmic beating that had become the soundtrack of her military career. In a few minutes, she would be flying into conditions that had already killed experienced crews, betting everything on the conviction that 24 years of experience could overcome insurmountable odds. Stevens stood near the hangar entrance watching the final preparations, his expression showing the frustration of someone who'd been excluded from the most important event of his career. Sarah almost felt sorry for the young lieutenant, recognizing his genuine desire to contribute to a mission that would test every skill she possessed. "Stevens," Sarah called out over the increasing engine noise, "monitor weather conditions and maintain communication with rescue coordination. If we run into trouble, you'll be our lifeline back to base." The assignment was more diplomatic than operationally necessary, but it gave Stevens a role that acknowledged his capabilities while keeping him safely away from conditions that exceeded his experience. The lieutenant nodded gratefully, apparently recognizing that Sarah's offer represented respect for his abilities rather than exclusion from important work. Harrison approached the aircraft for final words that would either be encouragement for a successful mission or farewell to crew members who might not return. The colonel's expression showed the weight of command decisions that affected lives in ways that staff assignments never could. "Captain Mitchell," Harrison said, raising his voice to be heard over the engine noise, "bring them home. All of them." Sarah nodded, understanding that Harrison's simple instruction carried the weight of careers, lives, and institutional philosophy. If she succeeded, experience would be vindicated and Stephen's technological approach would be questioned. If she failed, Harrison's faith in her judgment would be seen as a fatal error that cost multiple lives. "Roger, sir," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the confidence that came with absolute commitment to an impossible mission. As the Black Hawk lifted off into the Montana blizzard, Sarah felt the aircraft immediately begin fighting the winds that had grounded every other helicopter in the region. The familiar sensation of controlled flight was replaced by constant buffeting that made every control input a struggle against forces that wanted to tear the helicopter apart. But Sarah had flown in bad weather before, and she understood the difference between dangerous conditions and impossible ones. The mission ahead would test every skill she'd learned over 2 decades of military aviation. But she'd survived challenges that had killed other pilots by respecting the weather while refusing to be intimidated by it. 12 soldiers were waiting for a miracle on a mountain peak where helicopters weren't supposed to be able to fly. Sarah intended to prove that experience, judgment, and sheer determination could accomplish what technology and procedures said was impossible. The real test was just beginning. Part 4. Into the Storm. The moment the Black Hawk cleared the hangar, Sarah felt nature's full fury attempting to claim her aircraft. Wind gusts exceeding 80 miles per hour struck the helicopter from multiple directions simultaneously, creating a chaotic symphony of forces that would have overwhelmed most pilots within seconds. The aircraft bucked and twisted like an angry stallion, its control systems fighting to maintain stability against atmospheric conditions that exceeded every design specification. "Jesus Christ," Turner muttered through the intercom, his hands instinctively gripping his armrests as the helicopter pitched violently to the left, then snapped back to the right in a motion that defied normal flight physics. Sarah's response was purely instinctual, her hands and feet making constant micro-corrections to the controls as she read the aircraft's behavior through vibrations that traveled from the rotor system through the airframe to her nerve endings. 24 years of flying helicopters had taught her to interpret these signals faster than conscious thought, responding to threats before her brain fully processed what was happening. "Wind shear off the hangar is creating a downdraft," Sarah explained calmly, her voice betraying none of the concentration required to maintain control. "It'll smooth out once we clear the base perimeter." Rodriguez watched the ground disappear beneath them through his crew window, seeing Fort Blackwood's lights fade into the swirling snow like distant stars being swallowed by cosmic darkness. "Visibility dropping to near zero," he reported. "Ground references lost." Sarah fought the Black Hawk through air that felt more like liquid concrete than atmosphere, each gust creating forces that threatened to flip the aircraft inverted or slam it into the invisible terrain below. The helicopter's normal flight characteristics had been replaced by a constant battle against wind patterns that changed direction and intensity without warning, creating a 3-dimensional maze of atmospheric violence that would have been impossible to navigate using conventional techniques. The instrument panel told a story of systems being pushed beyond their design limits. Engine temperature gauges fluctuated wildly as the turbines struggled to maintain power in air so cold and turbulent that normal combustion patterns became erratic. Navigation displays flickered between accurate readings and complete nonsense. As GPS signals bounced off mountain peaks and magnetic compasses spun uselessly in the electromagnetic chaos created by the storm. "Approaching the foothills," Turner announced, His voice tight with concentration as he tried to make sense of navigation displays that seemed to be showing conflicting information. GPS is giving us position errors of plus or minus 2 miles. And the terrain radar is painting ghost returns from snow and ice crystals. Sarah nodded without taking her eyes off the few instruments that still seemed to be providing reliable information. The radar altimeter was the only piece of equipment she trusted completely, its radio waves bouncing off the ground below to give her precise distance measurements that couldn't be fooled by magnetic interference or satellite signal problems. Everything else was becoming advisory at best and potentially dangerous at worst. "We're flying dead reckoning from here," Sarah announced, using a navigation technique that predated modern electronics by centuries. "Time, distance, and heading. Based on visual references when we can get them." Rodriguez pressed his face against the crew window, trying to catch glimpses of terrain features through the swirling snow that reduced visibility to mere yards. "I can see tree lines occasionally," he reported. "Looks like we're following the valley floor, maybe 300 feet above ground level." The altitude was dangerously low for mountain flying, but it was the only way to maintain any kind of visual reference in conditions that had reduced the world to a gray-white sphere, extending perhaps 50 feet in any direction. Sarah was essentially flying blind, using the radar altimeter to avoid hitting the ground while relying on her memory of topographical maps to navigate toward the ranger's last known position. The radio crackled with intermittent transmissions from the stranded soldiers, their voices fading in and out as the mountains blocked and reflected radio signals in patterns that made communication nearly impossible. "Fort Blackwood, Ranger Delta. Casualties deteriorating. Need immediate. Situation critical." The broken transmission confirmed Sarah's worst fears. The Rangers weren't just cold and stranded anymore, they were dying, and every minute of flight time toward their position was another minute that medical emergencies were becoming fatalities. The mission had evolved from difficult rescue to desperate race against time. How much farther? Turner asked, though he knew the answer would be largely guesswork, given their navigation limitations. 25 minutes to the target area if we can maintain current speed and heading, Sarah replied, her voice betraying none of the uncertainty she felt about their actual position. "But we're going to have to climb to clear the ridgeline. And that's where things get interesting." The euphemism didn't fool anyone in the aircraft. Climbing meant leaving the relative protection of the valley floor and exposing themselves to the full fury of winds that were already testing the helicopter's structural limits. At higher altitudes, those winds would become even more violent, and the margin for error would disappear completely. The first indication of rising terrain came from the radar altimeter, which began showing steadily decreasing distance to the ground, despite Sarah's attempts to maintain level flight. The valley was rising toward the mountain passes, forcing her to choose between climbing into more dangerous wind conditions or following the terrain, so closely that a single pilot error would result in immediate ground impact. "Ground rising rapidly," Rodriguez warned. "We're down to 200 feet and decreasing." Sarah pulled collective to begin a climb that felt like ascending into hell itself. The moment the Black Hawk left the protection of the valley walls, wind gusts struck the aircraft with violence that defied description. The helicopter was thrown sideways like a toy, its main rotor blades flexing under loads that created vibrations throughout the airframe. "Holy shit," Turner breathed as the aircraft rolled nearly inverted before Sarah's control inputs brought it back to something resembling level flight. The climb became a series of violent encounters with air masses moving at different speeds and directions, each gust threatening to overwhelm the helicopter's ability to maintain controlled flight. Sarah found herself fighting not just to navigate toward the target, but simply to keep the aircraft from being torn apart by forces that seemed determined to destroy any machine foolish enough to challenge their domain. Engine warning lights. began illuminating on the caution panel as the turbines struggled to maintain power in conditions that were causing erratic fuel flow and combustion patterns. The engines were still running, but their performance was becoming increasingly unreliable as extreme cold and turbulence created operating conditions that no manufacturer had ever tested. Engine temperatures are fluctuating outside normal parameters, Turner reported, his voice betraying concern that went beyond professional alarm. We're getting intermittent fire warning lights, but engine performance seems stable. Sarah made mental note of the warnings while continuing to fight for control against winds that seemed to have developed malicious intelligence. False warnings were common in extreme conditions, but they could also indicate real problems that were being masked by the chaos of emergency flying. Either way, she had no choice but to continue toward the Ranger's position and hope that the engines would hold together long enough to complete the mission. The radio burst to life with another broken transmission that made everyone's blood run cold. Mayday, Mayday. Ranger Delta, losing personnel to exposure. 3 casualties. Critical, need extraction now. The desperation in the voice cut through the static and interference like a knife, confirming that the mission had become a race against death itself. The Rangers weren't just requesting rescue anymore, they were sending what might be there. Final transmission before hypothermia and injuries claimed lives that could still be saved. How much longer? Sarah asked herself as much as her crew, knowing that every minute of flight time was another minute that soldiers were dying on a mountain peak. 15 minutes to target area, Turner replied, though his navigation was largely guesswork based on dead reckoning and sporadic glimpses of terrain features. But we're going to have to find a way through the main ridgeline, and the winds up there are going to be even worse. Sarah could see the ridgeline ahead through brief gaps in the swirling snow, a jagged barrier of peaks and saddles that created a wall of stone reaching toward the storm-filled sky. The mountains looked like the spine of some prehistoric monster, their peaks disappearing into clouds that were generating the winds trying to kill her aircraft. Finding a pass through the ridgeline would require precise navigation and perfect timing, threading the helicopter through gaps between peaks, while fighting winds that could slam the aircraft into rock walls without warning. It was the kind of flying that killed experienced pilots in good weather, and Sarah was attempting it in conditions that had already grounded every other helicopter in the region. The approach to the ridgeline required a climbing turn that exposed the black hawk to cross winds coming from multiple directions simultaneously. The helicopter was buffeted like a leaf in a hurricane, its control responses becoming increasingly erratic as the flight controls struggled to maintain authority in air that seemed more concerned with destruction than supporting flight. There, Rodriguez called out, pointing through the crew window at a gap between peaks that was barely visible through the snow. Pass at 2 o'clock. Looks like it might be wide enough. Sarah banked toward the gap, feeling the aircraft fight. Her control inputs as winds flowing through the mountain pass created a Venturi effect that accelerated air to velocities that approached the helicopter's forward speed. Flying through the pass would be like threading a needle while riding a mechanical bull, requiring precision that exceeded normal human capabilities. The entry into the pass felt like flying into a wind tunnel designed by demons. The helicopter was immediately caught in a downdraft that slammed it toward the rocky floor of the gap, followed by an updraft that tried to throw it into the ceiling of clouds above. Sarah's control inputs became increasingly aggressive as she fought to maintain a flight path that would carry them through the pass without impacting the rock walls on either side. Altitude critical, Turner warned as the radar altimeter showed decreasing distance to terrain that was approaching from multiple directions. We're getting squeezed between the deck and the ceiling. Sarah could feel the aircraft being compressed into an ever-narrowing corridor of navigable airspace, with rock walls on both sides and turbulence above and below that wanted to destroy anything foolish enough to challenge their authority. The pass was becoming a gauntlet that would test every skill she'd developed over 2 decades of helicopter flying. The worst moment came when crosswinds struck the helicopter from both sides simultaneously, creating a resonance effect that set up dangerous vibrations in the main rotor system. The aircraft began shaking with an intensity that threatened to tear it apart. Metal fatigue accelerated by harmonic frequencies that could destroy even the strongest aircraft if sustained for more than a few seconds. Sarah's response was immediate and instinctual, changing the helicopter's attitude and airspeed to break the resonance pattern before it could cause structural failure. The maneuver required her to dive toward terrain that was already dangerously close, trading altitude for airspeed in a gamble that the vibrations would stop before the ground killed them all. The vibrations ceased as suddenly as they'd begun, but the dive had carried them within 50 feet of rock walls that flashed past the helicopter like the teeth of some massive predator. Sarah pulled collective and aft cyclic to arrest the descent, feeling the aircraft respond sluggishly to control inputs that should have been immediate and precise. "We're through," Rodriguez announced with obvious relief as they cleared the pass and entered the valley beyond. Target area should be about 5 miles ahead. But Sarah knew that reaching the target area was only the beginning of their challenges. Landing on a narrow ledge in zero visibility while fighting hurricane-force winds would require precision that exceeded anything she'd ever attempted. And doing it while injured soldiers waited for rescue would add pressure that could destroy judgment and lead to fatal errors. The valley beyond the pass was a bowl carved from solid rock, its walls rising steeply on all sides toward peaks that disappeared into the storm above. The Rangers were somewhere on a ledge near the upper end of the valley, trapped between the rock face above and a precipice below that would be fatal for anyone who lost their footing. "Beginning search pattern," Sarah announced, though she knew that finding a small group of people in conditions that reduced visibility to almost nothing would require luck as much as skill. The search became a methodical process of flying ever decreasing circles while maintaining the minimum altitude necessary to avoid terrain. Rodriguez scanned the rocky walls through his crew window, looking for any sign of human presence in a landscape that seemed designed to hide secrets. Turner monitored communications frequencies, hoping to establish contact with the Rangers before the helicopter's fuel supply forced them to abort the mission. The first sign of the stranded soldiers came from an unexpected source, a brief flash of light that cut through the swirling snow like a beacon. Rodriguez spotted it first, a concentrated beam that could only have come from a military-grade signaling device. "Light signal, 10 o'clock low," Rodriguez called out excitedly. "Looks like a strobe on the cliff face." Sarah banked toward the signal, feeling her heart rate increase as she realized they'd actually found the Rangers despite conditions that should have made location impossible. But finding them was only the first step in a rescue that would require landing on terrain that was barely suitable for helicopter operations under ideal conditions. The strobe light led them to a ledge that was perhaps 30 feet wide and 60 feet long, carved from the cliff face like a natural platform. But what looked manageable from altitude became terrifyingly small as Sarah approached for a closer inspection. The ledge was barely large enough for the Black Hawk's rotor diameter, with no margin for error and a 1,000-foot drop on 3 sides. "That's not a landing zone," Turner observed grimly. "That's a death trap." Sarah studied the ledge through brief gaps in the snow, calculating angles and distances with the precision of someone whose life depended on mathematical accuracy. The landing would require her to hover the helicopter with its main rotor blades extending beyond the edge of the cliff, maintaining position while Rangers loaded casualties aboard an aircraft that would be fighting to stay airborne every second. "It's going to be tight," Sarah admitted, "but it's doable if we can get the wind conditions to cooperate for about 10 minutes. Rodriguez was already preparing the rescue hoist, though they all knew that using it in current conditions would be nearly impossible. The wind would blow anyone on the end of the cable into the cliff face, and the helicopter's movement would make precise positioning impossible. The only option was a direct landing that would put the aircraft's wheels on the ledge, while keeping the rotor system clear of the rock wall. "Rangers, this is rescue flight," Turner transmitted on the emergency frequency. "We have you in sight and are preparing for landing approach. Prepare casualties for immediate evacuation." The response came back immediately, the voice of someone who'd given up hope and suddenly found it again. "Rescue flight, this is Ranger Delta. We have 3 critical casualties and 9 ambulatory personnel. Landing zone is extremely limited. Approach from the south if possible." Sarah began her approach from the direction the Rangers had suggested, fighting winds that seemed determined to prevent the rescue. The helicopter descended through turbulence that made precise control nearly impossible, each gust threatening to slam the aircraft into the cliff face or blow it off the narrow ledge entirely. The final approach required all of Sarah's experience and more luck than she wanted to admit. The helicopter settled toward the ledge with agonizing slowness, its rotor wash creating a whirlwind of snow and debris that reduced visibility to absolute zero. Sarah was flying entirely by feel, using the radar altimeter and her own instincts to judge distance and position. The moment the Black Hawk's wheels touched the ledge, Sarah knew they were balanced on the edge of disaster. The aircraft was stable for the moment, but any shift in wind direction or intensity could blow them off the mountain entirely. She would have to maintain perfect control while Rangers loaded casualties, knowing that a single mistake would kill everyone involved. "We're down," Sarah announced, though she knew their position was precarious at best. "Rodriguez, get those casualties aboard as fast as possible. We can't stay here long." The next few minutes would determine whether 24 years of flying experience could accomplish what everyone agreed was impossible, or whether the mountain would claim another helicopter and crew in its collection of aviation disasters. The Rangers moved with the efficient desperation of soldiers who understood that survival depended on speed and precision under impossible conditions. Part 4. The Ledge of Death. Rodriguez lowered the helicopter's cargo ramp, immediately exposing the cabin to winds that howled through the aircraft like the voices of the dead. Snow and ice crystals filled the air with such intensity that breathing became difficult, and visibility inside the helicopter dropped to almost nothing. The Rangers moved toward the aircraft like ghosts emerging from a nightmare, their forms barely visible through the whirlwind of frozen precipitation that surrounded the landing zone. Sarah felt the Black Hawk rock and shift on the narrow ledge as winds gusting to nearly 90 miles per hour struck the aircraft from different angles simultaneously. Each gust threatened to push the helicopter off the cliff or slam it into the rock wall, requiring constant control inputs to maintain even marginal stability. Her hands never stopped moving, making micro-corrections to collective and cyclic that kept the aircraft balanced on the knife edge between rescue and disaster. "First casualty coming aboard," Rodriguez reported through the intercom, his voice barely audible over the wind noise that filled the cabin. "Looks like spinal injuries, possible hypothermia." The injured Ranger was carried aboard by 2 of his teammates, their movements careful, but urgent as they navigated the helicopter's cabin while fighting winds that threatened to blow everyone off the mountain. Sarah could feel the aircraft's weight distribution change as personnel and equipment were loaded, requiring her to adjust power settings and control positions to maintain the precarious balance that kept them from sliding off the ledge. Turner monitored engine parameters while keeping one eye on the weather display, watching for any change in conditions that might give them a brief window of calmer air. "Engine temperatures are climbing," he reported. "We're at maximum power just to stay on the ground, and the engines are running hot from the extreme conditions." Sarah nodded grimly, understanding that they were operating the helicopter beyond its design limits in every possible way. The combination of high altitude, extreme cold, and maximum power settings was creating engine stress that could lead to catastrophic failure at any moment. But shutting down wasn't an option with injured soldiers still loading aboard, and the aircraft balanced on a ledge that offered no margin for error. "Second casualty aboard," Rodriguez announced as another injured ranger was carried into the cabin. "This one's unconscious, possible head trauma, and severe hypothermia." The loading process was taking longer than anyone had hoped, partially because of the difficult conditions, but mainly because the Rangers were taking care to avoid further injuring their wounded teammates. Sarah could feel precious minutes slipping away as the helicopter consumed fuel and the engines operated under stress that reduced their reliability with every passing second. A particularly violent gust struck the aircraft from the side, lifting the port wheel off the ledge and tilting the helicopter toward a 1,000-foot drop. Sarah responded instantly, adding power and adjusting cyclic to bring the aircraft back to level. But the maneuver consumed fuel and stressed systems that were already operating at their absolute limits. "Jesus Christ," Turner muttered as he watched the port side of the aircraft hang over empty space for several terrifying seconds. "We're one good gust away from going over the edge." Sarah felt sweat running down her back despite the frigid air flowing through the cabin, the physical stress of maintaining precise control in impossible conditions taking its toll on her body and mind. 24 years of flying experience were being compressed into minutes of decision-making that would determine whether the mission succeeded or failed catastrophically. "Third casualty coming aboard," Rodriguez called out. "That's all the critical wounded. 9 ambulatory personnel still need to get aboard." The loading of the remaining Rangers proceeded more quickly, but each additional person in the cabin changed the helicopter's center of gravity and required Sarah to make new calculations about power requirements and control responses. The Black Hawk was approaching its maximum weight limit, and taking off from the narrow ledge with a full load would require performance that exceeded the aircraft's specifications. "Weight and balance is getting critical," Turner warned as he monitored loading calculations on his display. "We're approaching maximum gross weight, and the altitude and temperature are already reducing our power available." Sarah had been calculating the same numbers in her head, knowing that a fully loaded helicopter would be barely able to maintain flight in the current conditions. Taking off from the ledge would require a vertical climb that might exceed the aircraft's power capabilities, potentially causing them to settle back onto the mountain with insufficient power to try again. "How many more?" Sarah asked Rodriguez through the intercom. 6 Rangers still on the ledge," Rodriguez replied. "They're moving as fast as they can, but the wind is making it dangerous to approach the aircraft." Sarah watched her fuel gauges with growing concern, knowing that every minute on the ledge consumed fuel they would need for the flight back to base. The mission was becoming a balance between saving all the Rangers and having enough fuel to get everyone home alive. Another massive gust struck the helicopter, this time lifting the entire aircraft off the ledge for several seconds before Sarah could regain contact with the ground. The moment of flight was terrifying rather than reassuring, demonstrating that the winds were strong enough to overcome the helicopter's weight even at maximum gross weight. "Winds getting stronger," Turner observed unnecessarily, his voice tight with stress as he watched the aircraft being buffeted like a toy. "We need to get out of here before conditions get any worse." The 4th and 5th Rangers climbed aboard. Together, their movements showing the exhaustion of soldiers who'd been fighting for survival in conditions that would have killed most people. Sarah could see in their faces the relief of rescue, mixed with the fear that they might still die if the helicopter couldn't get off the mountain. 2 more, Rodriguez announced. "The team leader is making sure everyone else gets aboard first." Sarah felt a surge of respect for the Ranger team leader who was following the military tradition of being the last person to leave a dangerous situation. But she also understood that his decision was creating additional risk for everyone aboard. The helicopter, as each extra minute on the ledge increased the chances of catastrophic wind conditions or mechanical failure. The penultimate ranger climbed aboard with obvious difficulty, his movements showing signs of hypothermia and exhaustion that made every step a struggle. Rodriguez helped him into the cabin while keeping one eye on the final team member who was still making his way toward the aircraft through winds that threatened to blow him off the ledge entirely. "Last man coming aboard," Rodriguez reported. "Team leader looks like he's in rough shape, but he's moving under his own power." Sarah watched the final ranger approach through her crew window, seeing a man who'd spent the last 6 hours keeping his team alive under conditions that would have broken most people. The team leader's determination was evident in every step, but his movements also showed the effects of exposure and stress that had pushed human endurance to its absolute limits. The moment the final ranger was aboard, Sarah began the takeoff sequence that would either save everyone or kill them all. The helicopter was loaded beyond its normal capabilities and operating in conditions that exceeded every safety parameter. But staying on the ledge any longer would guarantee disaster as fuel reserves dwindled and weather conditions continued to deteriorate. "Everyone aboard and secured," Rodriguez announced. "Ready for immediate departure." Sarah pulled collective and felt the helicopter strain to lift off from the narrow ledge, its engines screaming at maximum power while fighting air that seemed determined to prevent flight. The aircraft rose slowly, reluctantly, each foot of altitude requiring more power than the engines wanted to provide. "Power margins are critical," Turner warned. "We're pulling maximum available power, and we're barely maintaining positive rate of climb." The takeoff became a test of pilot skill, aircraft capability, and atmospheric cooperation that would determine whether the rescue succeeded or became another mountain aviation disaster. Sarah fought for every foot of altitude while the Black Hawk struggled against weight, weather, and physics that seemed aligned against their survival. A downdraft caught the helicopter just as it cleared the ledge, slamming it toward the valley floor with force that made everyone aboard feel their stomachs drop. Sarah countered with aggressive control inputs that pushed the aircraft to its structural limits, trading forward airspeed for altitude in a maneuver that would have been impossible with a less experienced pilot. "Altitude critical," Turner called out as the radar altimeter showed rapidly decreasing distance to terrain. "We're settling toward the valley floor." Sarah made the split-second decision to sacrifice altitude for airspeed, diving toward the valley floor to build forward velocity. That would give her more control options when fighting the winds that were trying to destroy the aircraft. The maneuver required perfect timing and precise control, as too much altitude loss would result in ground impact, while insufficient airspeed would leave them vulnerable to wind gusts that could flip the helicopter inverted. The Black Hawk accelerated through the dive, its engines finally operating in conditions that allowed them to develop full power. Sarah felt the aircraft's responses become more predictable as airspeed increased, giving her the control authority necessary to fight winds that had been overwhelming the helicopter's capabilities at lower speeds. "Airspeed building," Turner reported with obvious relief. 120 knots in climbing. The increased airspeed allowed Sarah to begin a climbing turn that would carry them out of the valley and toward the pass they'd used to reach, the Ranger's position. But she knew the return flight would be even more challenging than the approach, as the fully loaded helicopter would have less performance margin and reduced ability to recover from wind-induced upsets. The radio crackled with transmissions from Fort Blackwood, Colonel Harrison's voice carrying a mixture of relief and anxiety as he monitored the mission's progress. "Rescue flight, this is Fort Blackwood. Report status and estimated time of return." "Fort Blackwood, rescue successful," Turner replied. 12 Rangers aboard, 3 critical casualties requiring immediate medical attention. Estimated return time 45 minutes, but we're operating at maximum gross weight in extreme conditions. Sarah appreciated Turner's honest assessment of their situation, which prepared the base for the possibility that they might not make it home despite the successful pickup. The return flight would test every limit of aircraft performance and pilot skill, with no margin for error and no backup plan if something went wrong. The approach to the mountain pass required a climbing turn that pushed the heavily loaded helicopter to its absolute performance limits. Sarah could feel the aircraft struggling to maintain altitude as the engines operated at power settings that were beyond recommended limits, their performance degraded by the extreme cold and thin air of high altitude. Operations. Engine temperatures are redlining, Turner warned. We're operating beyond normal parameters, but the engines seem to be holding together. Sarah nodded while maintaining her focus on the increasingly difficult task of flying a helicopter that was fighting every control input. The Black Hawk was loaded so heavily that its normal flight characteristics had been replaced by sluggish responses and reduced control authority that made precise maneuvering nearly impossible. The entry into the mountain pass felt like flying into a hurricane, as winds compressed by the narrow gap between peaks created velocities that approached the helicopter's maximum forward speed. Sarah found herself fighting not just to navigate through the pass, but to maintain controlled flight against atmospheric forces that seemed determined to destroy any aircraft foolish enough to challenge their dominion. The passage through the mountains would determine whether 24 years of flying experience and the helicopter's performance capabilities were sufficient to bring 12 Rangers home alive, or whether the mountain would add another tragedy to its collection of aviation disasters. Part 5. Fighting the wind gods. The passage through the mountain pass with a fully loaded helicopter became an exercise in controlled desperation that tested every skill Sarah had developed over 2 decades of military aviation. The Black Hawk wallowed through air that felt more like thick syrup than atmosphere, its responses to control inputs delayed and unpredictable, as the aircraft struggled under a weight load that pushed it beyond normal performance parameters. Wind velocities in the pass had increased during their time on the ledge, creating a tunnel effect that accelerated air masses to speeds that approached the helicopter's forward velocity. Flying through the gap felt like swimming upstream against a river of violence, with crosswinds from multiple directions creating turbulence patterns that defied prediction or conventional flying techniques. Airspeed fluctuating wildly, Turner reported, his voice tight with concentration as he monitored instruments that painted a picture of an aircraft operating at the very edge of controllability. We're seeing variations of plus or minus 20 knots, and the power required to maintain altitude is exceeding normal specifications. Sarah felt the helicopter buck and yaw as competing wind masses struck it from different angles simultaneously, creating aerodynamic forces that tried to tear the aircraft apart while challenging her ability to maintain even basic flight parameters. The heavily loaded Black Hawk responded to her control inputs like a drunk giant, its movements sluggish and imprecise compared to the crisp responses she was accustomed to. Rodriguez monitored the Rangers in the cabin, many of whom were experiencing their first helicopter flight under conditions that would have terrified experienced aircrew. Passengers are hanging in there, he reported. The wounded are stable for now, but they need medical attention as soon as we can get them to a hospital. The reminder of the critical casualties aboard added psychological pressure to the already overwhelming task of flying in impossible conditions. Sarah knew that every minute of flight time was another minute that injured soldiers were suffering without proper medical care, but pushing the aircraft beyond its capabilities would only guarantee that everyone aboard died together. A massive downdraft caught the helicopter as it approached the narrowest part of the pass, slamming it toward the rocky floor with force that made the airframe groan under stress loads that approached structural limits. Sarah countered with maximum collective input, pulling every available ounce of power from engines that were already operating beyond their design parameters. Altitude critical, Turner called out as the radar altimeter showed. Rapidly decreasing distance to terrain that was rising to meet them. We're down to 50 feet and descending. Sarah felt the helicopter sink toward terrain that would destroy everyone aboard if she couldn't arrest the descent within the next few seconds. The aircraft was so heavily loaded that its normal climb performance had been reduced to almost nothing, and the extreme conditions were further degrading what little power was available. Her response was immediate and desperate, trading forward airspeed for lift by pulling the helicopter into a climbing attitude that bordered on dangerous. The maneuver worked, barely, as the Black Hawk's descent slowed and finally stopped just 20 feet above rocks that would have ended the mission catastrophically. Made it, Turner breathed with obvious relief. But we're at maximum power and barely maintaining altitude. The climb out of the pass required every bit of performance the helicopter could provide, with engines screaming at power settings that Sarah knew couldn't be sustained indefinitely. She could feel the aircraft vibrating under the stress of maximum power operation, metal fatigue accelerated by forces that exceeded normal operating parameters by dangerous margins. The moment they cleared the pass and entered the valley beyond, Sarah felt some of the crushing pressure ease as the helicopter escaped the compressed winds that had been trying to destroy it. But she knew the relief was temporary, as the flight back to Fort Blackwood would require another 40 minutes of flying in conditions that were testing every system aboard the aircraft. Weather update from base shows conditions deteriorating along our route, Turner reported after receiving a radio transmission from Fort Blackwood. Winds are increasing and visibility is dropping even further. They're recommending we consider alternate landing sites if possible. Sarah considered the suggestion while fighting to maintain altitude and heading in air that continued to buffet the heavily loaded helicopter. Alternate landing sites would reduce flight time and might offer better weather conditions, but they would also mean landing at unfamiliar airfields without the medical facilities that the wounded Rangers desperately needed. Negative on alternate sites, Sarah decided. The casualties need a hospital, and Fort Blackwood has the medical facilities to handle trauma cases. We're going home. The decision committed them to a flight path that would take them directly through the worst of the storm system, but Sarah knew it was the right choice despite the increased risk. The wounded Rangers had already waited too long for medical attention, and diverting to facilities that couldn't handle their injuries would be trading one kind of disaster for another. The flight across the Montana wilderness became a marathon of endurance that tested pilot, aircraft, and passengers in ways that normal operations never approached. Sarah found herself making constant adjustments to power settings and flight controls as the helicopter fought its way through air masses that seemed determined to prevent any aircraft from surviving the journey. Fuel consumption is higher than calculated, Turner reported after checking their remaining supply against the distance still to be covered. The maximum power settings required to maintain flight are burning fuel faster than planned. We should have enough to reach base, but our reserve margins are getting thin. The fuel situation added another layer of stress to an already overwhelming flight, as running out of gas would be just as fatal as any other kind of mechanical failure. Sarah began calculating alternate power settings that might reduce fuel consumption while still providing enough performance to maintain controlled flight. Engine warning lights began illuminating with increasing frequency as the power plant struggled to maintain output in conditions that were causing erratic combustion and thermal stress. The warnings weren't indicating immediate failure, but they painted a picture of systems being pushed beyond their design limits in ways that could lead to catastrophic problems without warning. Engine number 2 is showing intermittent over-temperature warnings, Turner reported. Oil pressure is still good, but the extreme power settings are creating thermal conditions that exceed normal operating parameters. Sarah acknowledged the warning while continuing to fight for altitude and airspeed that would keep them ahead of the weather system that was pursuing them across the landscape. The helicopter was holding together for now, but she could feel the aircraft aging years. With every minute extreme operation. The radio brought welcome news as they approached the halfway point of their return flight. Rescue flight, this is Fort Blackwood Medical. Be advised, trauma team is standing by for immediate casualty reception. Landing zone is clear, and emergency. Vehicles are positioned for rapid patient transfer. Fort Blackwood Medical, Roger, Turner replied. 3 critical casualties aboard, possible spinal injuries and severe hypothermia. Estimated arrival in 25 minutes. The confirmation that medical help was waiting provided some relief to everyone aboard. But Sarah knew that reaching the base was still far from certain given the deteriorating conditions and the aircraft's marginal performance. The Black Hawk was flying on borrowed time and borrowed power, held aloft by pilot skill and mechanical reliability that couldn't be guaranteed to last much longer. A particularly violent series of wind gusts struck the helicopter as they crossed an exposed ridgeline, creating turbulence that exceeded anything Sarah had experienced in 24 years of flying. The aircraft was thrown around like a toy, its control responses overwhelmed by forces that seemed determined to destroy any machine foolish enough to challenge their authority. For several terrifying seconds, Sarah felt the helicopter completely lose controlled flight as competing wind masses created chaotic patterns that exceeded the aircraft's ability to maintain stable flight. She fought the controls with every ounce of strength and skill she possessed, gradually regaining some semblance of control as they descended into the relative protection of another valley. "Holy shit," Rodriguez muttered through the intercom. "I thought we were done for sure." Sarah didn't reply, saving her energy for the continued battle against conditions that showed no sign of improving. The helicopter had survived the worst turbulence she'd ever encountered, but she knew that similar conditions lay ahead as they continued toward Fort Blackwood. The final 20 minutes of flight became a test of endurance that pushed everyone aboard to their limits. Sarah's hands ached from fighting the controls. Her back was rigid with tension, and her mind was operating on adrenaline and determination that couldn't be sustained indefinitely. But 12 Rangers were counting on her to bring them home alive. And failure wasn't an option she was willing to consider. As the lights of Fort Blackwood finally became visible through the swirling snow, Sarah felt a surge of relief mixed with the determination needed to complete one final approach in conditions that had already claimed other aircraft. The base was there, medical help was waiting, and they were almost home. But landing would require one last demonstration that experience could overcome impossible odds. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.